December 16, 1944. 5:30 in the morning, perched on the ridge that overlooked Lanzerath, Belgium. 18 American soldiers were dug into frozen foxholes, watching as 1,600 German guns tore apart the dawn sky with an unrelenting barrage. First Lieutenant Lyle Book, barely 20 years old, commanded the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon. They'd been expecting nothing more than routine patrol work, the kind of duty soldiers got on what everyone called the quiet sector. Then, emerging through the swirling snow and smoke, came 500 elite German paratroopers pouring out from the tree line below. Fallschirmjäger, Hitler's finest infantry troops, and the sharp edge of the massive Ardennes offensive. The numbers were brutal and straightforward, 500 against 18. Military doctrine said this would be finished in minutes. The radio crackled with orders. Hold your position, no reinforcements were coming, retreat was not authorized. Just a frozen ridge, light weapons, and young men who had never faced anything remotely like this. The Germans needed to reach their objective by early afternoon. Behind them, comfortable armored columns were already rolling forward, counting on this road junction to stay open. But as the first German assault waves started up the slope, something unfolded that no military academy had ever prepared them for. 18 men in the right place sometimes could stop 500. Impossible, it seemed, had just never been attempted quite this way before. The artillery bombardment stopped as abruptly as it had begun, replaced by a silence that somehow felt more threatening than the 90 minutes of destruction that came before it. Steam rose from the snow where hot shell fragments had burned through. The sharp smell of cordite hung in the air, mixing with the clean, bitter cold of winter. First Lieutenant Lyle Book pressed his face against the frozen earth at the edge of his foxhole, trying to see through binoculars that kept fogging over from the temperature shift. His hands, wrapped in wool gloves, had gone completely numb from gripping his rifle. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon had held this ridge for 3 weeks with nothing to report. 18 men spread thin across a 1,000-yard front. They were the 394th Infantry Regiment's eyes and ears. Their job was straightforward. Watch for enemy movement approaching Lanzerath, report what they saw, and hold up any German push long enough for the main defensive line to get ready. Nobody had expected that main line to vanish overnight. Book lowered his binoculars and looked over his men. Staff Sergeant Samuel Uhash had spent the bombardment crawling from foxhole to foxhole in a low crouch, moving ammunition around methodically. His work carried the calm certainty of a soldier who understood that being prepared meant staying alive. Sergeant James Sakanicus was hunched over his radio, wrestling with frequencies to punch through the static that had made communication nearly impossible since dawn. The SCR-300 was their only link to battalion headquarters, but German jamming made every transmission risky. The ridge itself offered excellent shooting down the slope toward Lanzerath and the road winding through it. Book had personally selected these positions, reading the terrain with the sharp analytical mind that had made him the 99th Infantry Division's youngest commissioned officer. The Germans would have to push uphill into exposed ground, while his men stayed hidden in foxholes they'd spent weeks preparing. Snow worked as camouflage, and the steep slope would scatter any coordinated attack. On paper, it looked like a perfect defensive setup. Then movement caught his eye in the tree line. Not random snow falling from branches, but deliberate shifts in position. Men trying to stay concealed. Book raised his binoculars again, focusing carefully. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Field green uniforms moving through the forest in extended line formation. Too many to count quickly, far more than any normal patrol or reconnaissance team. He kept his voice steady and quiet. "Get battalion on the radio." It took several tries, but the radio came alive. The voice answering was distant and broken by static, but Book got through. He reported what he was seeing. A large German formation, estimated battalion strength approaching from the southeast. The reply came garbled but unmistakable: hold position. Reinforcements would arrive when possible, maintain observation, and continue reporting. Sergeant William Smoyer low-crawled to Book's foxhole, his weathered face tight with concern. At 28, he was older than most of the platoon, a steady hand who'd kept younger soldiers calm through their first real combat in the Hurtgen forest. The tree line is moving all along the front, sir. This isn't any probe. I know. Book kept watching through his binoculars. The approaching Germans were moving with the tight spacing of veteran troops, not the loose groupings of inexperienced men. These soldiers knew what they were doing. Pass the word to every position. Hold fire until I signal. Let them get closer. The night cold had deepened further, and breath vapor marked every whispered exchange between foxholes. Corporal Milton Schaub, the artillery forward observer with the platoon, had his targeting board ready, carefully marking calculations for fire missions that might never happen. His mathematical precision had already worked out ranges and corrections for every possible German approach. Book tried the radio again, asking for immediate artillery support on the coordinates Schaub had prepared. The response crackled and cut out, but the meaning was clear. No artillery available, all guns were dealing with German counterfire. The platoon was completely alone. The first German soldiers appeared below, emerging from the tree line roughly 400 yards down the slope. They moved in short, coordinated rushes, covering for each other with the smooth teamwork of experienced soldiers. Book could see the distinctive German paratrooper helmets and the patterned camouflage smocks identifying Fallschirmjäger units. These were not ordinary Wehrmacht infantry, but Hitler's elite airborne soldiers, combat veterans from Crete and Italy. They spread across the slope in a skirmish line that extended beyond Book's defensive positions on both sides. The lieutenant counted rapidly, calculating strength from spacing and formation patterns. At least 2 companies, possibly more. The math was simple and grim. Between 400 and 500 German paratroopers were advancing against 18 Americans. Book keyed his radio one more time, his voice urgent but controlled. This is Limestone 3. Request immediate reinforcement. Enemy infantry estimated at 500 approaching our position. When the response came, it barely cut through the static. Limestone 3. Hold your position. Support unavailable at this time. Something cold moved through Book's chest that had nothing to do with December weather. The units covering his flanks had pulled back during the night without notice, leaving gaps the Germans were already moving into. His platoon wasn't just outnumbered, they were completely cut off. He looked along the line of foxholes, each one holding men who were counting on him to make the right call. Some were barely 19, their faces still young despite weeks of fighting. Others, like Smoyer and Juhasz, had experienced enough combat to understand what the next hours would bring. Every one of them was watching him, waiting for orders that would decide whether they'd make it through the day alive. The German advance kept moving methodically forward. Lead elements had closed to 200 yards, close enough that Book could make out individual faces under their helmets. They showed no sign of knowing they'd been spotted, moving with the confidence of soldiers expecting minimal resistance. Book made his choice. They would hold the ridge. They would not run. They would not give up without making the Germans pay. 18 men with solid ground, disciplined shooting, and prepared positions could slow things down enough to matter. The German timeline demanded rapid progress through this sector. Each minute of delay would back up traffic behind the leading units. Reinforcements and supply convoys would start piling up. He keyed his radio one last time. This is Limestone 3. We are heavily engaged. Enemy strength estimated 500. We are maintaining our position. The German lead elements reached the 100-yard mark. Book gave the signal. Sergeant Smoyer's rifle cracked once across the snowy slope, and 18 American weapons erupted in unison. The coordinated volley hit the advancing Fallschirmjäger in the open. Their grey-green shapes suddenly toppled and fell against the white snow backdrop. The trap had worked. Book had deliberately let the German point squads move through his positions, letting them think the ridge was empty and waiting. Now those lead elements were caught between his forward foxholes and the main German force below, trapped in crossfire that turned their advantage into something else entirely. A slaughter. The Americans had seized a critical advantage by turning their smaller numbers into something far more dangerous. A perfectly executed ambush that multiplied their firepower through clever use of the land and split-second timing. Staff Sergeant Juhasz's voice cut through the frigid air as he orchestrated fire from the left side of their position, his commands carrying across the frozen terrain with unmistakable authority. The Browning automatic rifles under his control wove together a lethal web of grazing fire that swept methodically down the slope, forcing German soldiers to scramble for whatever shelter the landscape offered. Pine stumps and shallow hollows that provided almost no defense against bullets coming down from above. Private First Class Chakanik set aside his radio duties and seized his M1 rifle, working it with the focused rhythm of a man who had found his purpose. 8-round clips ejected with sharp metallic cracks as he picked off targets across the terrain. His position anchored the right flank, where Corporal Schwanz had constructed a small observation nest that gave him a commanding view for directing the platoon's single 30-caliber machine gun. That weapon occupied a dugout depression, overhead protection overhead while allowing maximum sweep down the mountainside. The gunner moved his weapon side to side in steady, measured motions, firing short bursts that held down ammunition expenditure while maintaining constant pressure on the German positions. 6 to 8 rounds at a time forced entire enemy squads to hug the ground, breaking up their attempts to launch coordinated attacks up the hill. Major Rudolf Langhauser had anticipated clearing this ridge in roughly 20 minutes, a straightforward tactical problem his men had rehearsed repeatedly during their training deployment across occupied France. The German paratroopers were legendary for their rapid infiltration skills, and his lead companies were supposed to overwhelm any American positions through sheer speed and aggression, clearing the way for the armored vehicles already staging behind his lines. Instead, his assault troops found themselves exposed in open terrain, taking casualties from defensive positions they hadn't even detected during their approach. The Americans had exercised remarkable patience, waiting until the entire German formation revealed itself before unleashing their fire. Langhauser watched helplessly as his men sought shelter wherever they could find it. But the ridge itself belonged to the defenders. They commanded every fold and crease in the ground below them. The first German assault consumed 30 minutes before Langhauser ordered his men to pull back and regroup. 16 paratroopers lay dead in the snow, and dozens more were too badly wounded to continue fighting. The Americans had not lost a single man, protected by well-constructed foxholes that had been refined and improved during weeks of defensive preparation. Book used the temporary pause to redistribute ammunition and move between his men, assessing their condition. Every rifleman had begun the engagement carrying 80 rounds of 30-caliber ammunition, while the automatic riflemen hauled 300 rounds each. The machine gun crew possessed 600 linked rounds, but sustained fire was already consuming ammunition faster than anticipated. He moved methodically between positions, collecting unused ammunition from wounded Germans scattered across the battlefield and redistributing it according to how quickly each foxhole burned through its supply. Chakanicus re-established his radio connection with battalion headquarters, transmitting details of the engagement and requesting immediate artillery support. The response crushed any hope of reinforcement. No fire missions available, all artillery assets were committed to counter-battery operations. His platoon would have to survive on whatever ammunition and courage they could muster. Fonsed had been tracking German positions all morning, monitoring radio traffic and studying movement patterns until he'd pinpointed Langhauser's command post, a stone building in Lanzerath village where the German officer coordinated with his companies through landline and radio. According to the German timetable, this ridge should have fallen by noon, allowing the Kampf group of Piper's tanks to begin rolling toward the Meuse River crossings. Now everything was slipping behind schedule. The second assault arrived from 2 angles at once. Langhauser had learned from his initial failure, this time committing his reserve company to a flanking maneuver designed to strike the Americans from their left, while his main force attacked frontally. It was textbook military doctrine: divide the American fire, crack their defensive line, pour through the gaps. Book recognized the danger immediately and adjusted his strategy. He pulled 2 men from his right flank to bolster his left side, betting that the frontal assault was merely a distraction. Smoyer assumed command of the reinforced sector, arranging his men to create interlocking fields of fire that would transform the German flanking movement into a slaughter zone. The fighting reached a new intensity as German paratroopers clawed their way to within 50 yards, pressing forward through coordinated rushes supported by disciplined automatic fire. Close-range firefights erupted along the American line as German squad leaders probed for weak points between foxholes. The distance had become intimate enough that combatants could see individual faces, adding a raw personal element to the violence that demanded as much nerve as marksmanship. Private Robert Lambert, barely 19 years old, suddenly found himself confronting 3 German paratroopers who had infiltrated to within grenade-throwing distance. His M1 rifle seized up on the 7th round, leaving only his bayonet as his enemy closed the final distance. Lambert's hands shook from cold and surging adrenaline as he fixed the bayonet, then settled into his foxhole and waited for the sound of boots crunching through snow. Hush erupted from the neighboring position, his Thompson submachine gun roaring as he engaged the infiltrators at nearly point-blank range. The .45 caliber rounds flattened all 3 paratroopers within yards of Lambert's foxhole. Though one German managed to hurl a grenade that detonated uselessly in the snow between positions. The second assault crumbled after 45 minutes, leaving another dozen bodies scattered down the slope. Langhauser's flanking maneuver had failed entirely, channeled into prepared killing zones that transformed his tactical imagination into just another frontal assault. His battalion had now fought for over 2 hours without achieving any meaningful objective, and the armored units waiting behind him were growing visibly impatient. Buck checked his watch, 10:30 in the morning. His men had endured continuous attack for 5 hours, burning through ammunition at a rate that would leave them depleted before darkness fell. Yet they held their position. They kept inflicting casualties on an enemy force that outnumbered them by more than 20 to 1. The German operational schedule lay in ruins, delays cascading backward through the entire offensive as vehicles jammed up behind Langhauser's stalled battalion. By noon, the impossible had become routine. 18 Americans occupied their ridge for 6.5 hours, repelling assault after assault from an enemy force that should have overwhelmed them in minutes. Snow around their foxholes had turned red with German blood, and the slope below resembled a burial ground with bodies marking the point where each attack had collapsed. Buck moved between positions during a break in the assault, checking ammunition and assessing his men's morale with the quiet efficiency that had held them together since the fighting began. Each foxhole told a consistent story, ammunition running low but spirits rising. Private Lambert had 18 rounds left for his rifle. Sergeant Smoyer retained only his final magazine. The machine gun crew had expended 400 rounds of linked ammunition, leaving barely 200 for whatever came next. But these men had transformed. The frightened teenagers who'd huddled during the initial bombardment had become something harder and more purposeful. They moved with the economical precision of seasoned combat veterans, conserving ammunition and energy while maintaining disciplined fire that made their defense devastatingly effective. Every German attack had met coordinated volleys that converted assault troops into casualties before they could breach the American line. Langhauser faced a nightmare scenario that threatened everything he'd built. His battalion had deteriorated to less than 3/4 strength, 63 wounded, 16 killed in action. Far worse, his timetable had disintegrated completely. Combat Group Piper's armor remained stacked behind his positions, tanks and half-tracks idling uselessly while their engines consumed precious fuel, never designed for extended stationary operation. Piper himself had begun flooding Langhauser with increasingly urgent radio demands. Why was a single American platoon holding up an entire SS Panzer division? The answer was militarily sound but professionally ruinous. 18 determined men with superior ground could stop 500 if they possessed the willingness to die, and these Americans showed every indication of doing exactly that. Piper's exasperation reverberated through the entire German command hierarchy. The Ardennes offensive depended on speed and momentum, with rigid schedules that tolerated no flexibility for unexpected complications. Every hour, Langhauser's battalion remained stalled meant another hour for American reinforcements to move into blocking positions along the planned German route. The narrow Belgian roads that favored rapid German movement also functioned as choke points. Minor delays became major catastrophes. At 12:30, Langhauser committed his reserve company to a coordinated assault from 3 directions simultaneously. This time, he abandoned infiltration tactics and clever maneuvers. Concentrated firepower and overwhelming numbers would carry the ridge through sheer force, regardless of casualty costs. His paratroopers fixed bayonets and prepared for a final assault that would determine the fate of the northern shoulder of the entire German offensive. Blakan Ekas had maintained sporadic radio contact with battalion headquarters throughout the morning, reporting German casualties and requesting support that never materialized. His latest transmission delivered devastating news. The American units positioned on either side of the platoon had withdrawn during the night, leaving gaps that German reconnaissance had already found and exploited. The ridge now sat completely isolated, surrounded on three sides by German forces methodically closing in. Book received this information with the same calm practicality he'd applied to every crisis since dawn. Tactical isolation changed nothing about the mission or their defensive situation. His men still controlled the high ground, still commanded the road through Lankerath, and still carried enough ammunition for one more major engagement. The German timetable remained shattered, and every additional hour of resistance amplified the strategic consequences of their defense. Corporal Schwanz had been plotting German positions throughout the morning, using observed fire and movement patterns to construct a detailed enemy map. His forward observer training allowed him to read the battlefield with professional skill, identifying command posts and assembly areas invisible to ordinary infantry. The picture emerging was both encouraging and terrifying. The Germans had committed everything to this single objective with no reserves held back. The third major assault commenced at 1 o'clock, preceded by a barrage from German mortars and infantry guns. The bombardment was concentrated but brief, intended to suppress American fire during the crucial minutes when German infantry would cross open ground. Book's men pressed themselves into their foxhole bottoms as high explosive shells burst overhead, coating them with frozen earth and pine fragments. When the barrage ceased, 3 companies of German paratroopers rose from concealed positions and advanced uphill. No tactical subtlety this time. 500 men moved in extended lines, covering each other with sustained automatic fire that forced Americans to remain low during the assault's critical opening phase. The volume of incoming fire exceeded anything the Americans had previously experienced. German machine guns and automatic rifles created a constant roar that made communication between foxholes nearly impossible. Bullets snapped overhead with the angry sound of insects striking frozen ground and ricocheting unpredictably, adding psychological weight to the physical danger of direct fire. Book waited until the German assault lines reached the 75-yard mark before ordering his men to fire. His soldiers rose from their foxholes like mechanical automatons, rifles and automatic weapons, engaging targets with the precision of hardened combat veterans. The opening volley dropped a dozen German paratroopers, but the remainder pressed forward with the focused determination of elite troops. Individual firefights ignited along the American perimeter as German squads reached grenade range for their final push. The Browning automatic rifle chattered continuously from the left, controlled bursts sweeping the slope methodically while preserving ammunition for targets that mattered. The machine gun crew traversed their weapon relentlessly, long bursts establishing beaten zones of fire that infantry could not possibly cross. But German numbers were grinding away at American resistance. Paratroopers who fell to American fire were replaced by others who stepped over their bodies and continued climbing. The assault had become purely mathematical. The mathematics of warfare had become brutally simple. German casualties measured against American ammunition, with time as the only variable that would determine which side prevailed. Private Lambert squeezed off his final round, drawing a bead on a German squad leader who had closed the distance to 30 yards. The bolt of his M1 rifle locked back hard against an empty chamber. In that moment, he understood with absolute clarity that the cruel arithmetic of small unit combat had finally caught up with them. 18 men could not kill 500, regardless of how strong their positions were or how perfectly disciplined their fire discipline proved to be. The ridge that had appeared so formidable in the grey light of dawn was about to fall to nothing more than basic mathematics, yet those 18 had held it for 8 hours. 8 hours. That was enough to reshape an entire battle, enough to alter the fate of nations hanging in the balance. The veteran German paratroopers reached the American foxholes at 2:15 in the afternoon, 8 hours and 45 minutes after the first shots had rung out across the snow. Private Lambert thrust his bayonet upward to meet the first German to reach him, the blade finding flesh below the ribs. But two more paratroopers were already flanking his position from opposite directions. Within minutes, the entire perimeter erupted into a chaos of hand-to-hand combat, as the numerical advantage that had been building steadily throughout the day finally overwhelmed the defensive fire. Buch emptied his .45 pistol at a German squad leader, orchestrating the final push, then hurled the useless weapon at another paratrooper scrambling into Sergeant Smoyer's foxhole. Combat had regressed to its most primitive state. Entrenching tools and rifle butts became weapons. Bayonets found their mark. The controlled defensive discipline that had defined the morning's action dissolved into desperate individual struggles decided by physical strength and raw will to survive. Staff Sergeant Uhosh continued working his Thompson submachine gun until the bolt locked back against an empty magazine, then swung the weapon like a club against German paratroopers pouring over his section of the line. His careful redistribution of ammunition throughout the morning had bought them crucial hours, but mathematics ultimately proved stronger than tactics. 18 men simply could not carry enough bullets to kill 500 attackers, no matter how excellent their defensive positions. The machine gun crew fought until the very end, sweeping their weapon back and forth until the final belt of ammunition ran dry. When German paratroopers reached their gun position, the gunner still struggled to clear a jam that had left his weapon useless. The assistant gunner died protecting the gun, his bayonet and neck becoming the last defense, his body falling across the receiver in a posture that captured something both futile and profoundly symbolic about the entire defense. Major Langhäuser personally led the final assault that swept across the ridge. His Schmeisser submachine gun chattered as he moved between American foxholes, still offering sporadic resistance. The cost to his battalion was devastating, less than 60% combat effective, with German casualties scattered across the slope as grim testimony to the ferocity of American defensive fire. But the ridge was finally his, and the road through Lanzerath lay open for the armored spearhead waiting behind his position since dawn. The fighting stopped as suddenly as it had started. German paratroopers, who seconds before had been locked in hand-to-hand struggle, now accepted the surrender of Americans who had expended their ammunition and exhausted their remaining options. Buch raised his hands slowly, blood streaming from a head wound inflicted by a rifle butt during the final melee. 14 of his men were wounded but alive. 3 had been killed in those final desperate minutes of fighting. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon ceased to exist as an organized military unit, yet they had accomplished their mission with a precision that would only become fully understood decades later. The delay they imposed on German operations rippled through the entire northern sector of the Ardennes offensive, creating traffic jams and cascading scheduling problems that multiplied exponentially as hours passed. Kampfgruppe Piper's armor consumed precious fuel while idling behind Langhäuser's stalled infantry, burning through reserves and constraining their tactical options for that crucial first day. The German plan had demanded armored spearheads reach the Meuse River crossings within 48 hours of the initial assault. That ambitious schedule depended entirely on maintaining the momentum that had just been lost on a snow-covered ridge overlooking an obscure Belgian village. Every hour of delay allowed American forces to reposition Ardennes and reinforce, transforming an attempted surprise breakthrough into a meeting engagement where defenders held the advantage of interior lines. Joachim Piper arrived at the ridge an hour after its capture, his staff car threading through German casualties, being evacuated by medics who had waited since morning for the fighting to finally end. His examination of the American positions revealed the tactical sophistication that had made their defense so remarkably effective. Foxholes had been sited with perfectly overlapping fields of fire. Ammunition had been distributed according to calculated rates of consumption, and every advantage of terrain had been exploited with professional competence. The young SS colonel studied the frozen battlefield with the analytical eye of a staff college graduate, recognizing tactical excellence even displayed by an enemy who had cost him irreplaceable time and casualties. 18 Americans holding good ground and firing with discipline had stopped his entire spearhead for virtually a full day, demonstrating defensive principles that European armies had been teaching for centuries but rarely witnessed executed with such precision. When Piper interrogated the captured Americans, their command structure became clear. First Lieutenant Book had coordinated the action with calm professionalism, making tactical decisions under extreme pressure that maximized his unit's combat effectiveness. Staff Sergeant Uhosh had managed logistics and ammunition distribution with the expertise of a quartermaster professional. Several soldiers had contributed technical expertise that allowed accurate fire control despite the complete absence of artillery support. The German colonel showed particular interest in Private First-Class Sakanikas, whose radio communications had maintained contact with higher headquarters throughout the entire battle. The young American had demonstrated technical innovation that German military doctrine consistently underestimated, adapting equipment and procedures to defeat German jamming attempts that should have isolated the ridge completely. Yet individual competence could not alter the strategic reality, becoming increasingly apparent as German units throughout the northern sector reported similar delays and unexpected resistance. American forces had used the months since Normandy to improve their tactical proficiency, transforming divisions that had been dismissed as second-rate into competent defensive forces capable of extracting a price for every mile of German advance. The prisoners were marched down the slope they had defended so successfully, passing German casualties bearing witness to the effectiveness of that morning's fire. Langhäuser's paratroopers showed them the grudging respect elite troops reserve for worthy opponents, sharing cigarettes and medical supplies with Americans who had cost them friends and comrades, but had fought with undeniable courage. Behind the ridge, German armor finally began advancing forward, tanks and half-tracks grinding through snow toward objectives that should have been reached before noon. The mechanical roar of Piper's column filled the valley as tracked vehicles negotiated terrain that had been scouted but never prepared for heavy traffic. Fuel consumption was already exceeding planned rates, and maintenance problems were emerging in vehicles designed for rapid movement rather than extended cross-country operations. The Battle of Lanzerath Ridge had ended, but its consequences were spreading through both armies in ways that would only become apparent once the broader Ardennes offensive had run its full course. 18 American soldiers had purchased time with their liberty and their lives, time measured not in hours, but in the strategic opportunities that delay had created for Allied forces throughout the theater. The ridge had fallen, but the German timetable lay in ruins, and in mechanized warfare, timetables determined victory or defeat. Langhäuser filed his after-action report that evening, documenting casualties and tactical lessons with Prussian thoroughness while avoiding any mention of the operational implications of his delayed advance. His military career would not survive the broader failure of the Ardennes offensive, but his tactical competence had never been questioned. He had taken his objective against determined resistance, fulfilling his orders despite costs that would haunt him for life. The freight car carrying his men toward Germany was unheated, overcrowded, and reeked of human suffering. 47 prisoners shared a space designed for livestock, their bodies pressed together as their only defense against December cold. Chornier had developed a fever from an infected wound, and Smoyer was fighting the onset of frostbite creeping into his feet. The journey to Stalag 4B consumed 6 days, each one marked by the number of men who grew too weak to stand during infrequent stops for water and black bread. Book spent the journey replaying the battle in his mind, analyzing each tactical decision, wondering whether different choices might have saved lives or prolonged their defense. The same analytical mind that had made him an effective platoon leader now turned inward, examining failures and missed opportunities with methodical precision. His men needed leadership, and leadership in captivity meant maintaining morale and discipline under deliberately crushing conditions. The prisoners arrived at their destination on Christmas Eve, marching through snow toward barbed wire compounds that would be their home until the war's end. Staff Sergeant Uhosh organized the Americans into work details and resource-sharing groups that maximized survival odds, applying the same logistical expertise that had sustained their ridge defense to this different but equally critical challenge of staying alive in captivity. His quiet competence became a steadying force for younger prisoners who had never imagined American soldiers could be caged. Meanwhile, the strategic consequences of their stand were rippling through both armies in ways that would only be fully understood when historians examined German records decades later. Kampfgruppe Peiper's armor finally broke through American lines on December 17th, 20 hours behind schedule and with fuel reserves severely depleted by extended idling while waiting for infantry to clear the road. The delay imposed at Lanzerath compounded with similar delays throughout the northern sector, creating cascading logistical problems German planners had never anticipated. The German offensive reached its furthest penetration on December 24th, the same day Buch's men arrived in prison camp. Peiper's spearhead had advanced within 4 miles of the Meuse River before running out of fuel and ammunition, stranded in enemy territory without supply lines or reinforcement. The timetable disrupted by 18 Americans on a ridge never recovered, and mechanized warfare without precise timing became merely an expensive form of suicide. By January 15, 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed completely. German forces retreating toward the Rhine River and leaving behind equipment that could never be replaced. The strategic reserve Hitler had assembled for his final Western gamble had been expended achieving temporary gains abandoned within a month. German casualties exceeded 100,000 men, losses that effectively ended any possibility of German defensive success on the Western Front. The prisoners in Stalag B followed the war's progress through smuggled radio broadcasts and conversations with newly arrived captives, bringing news from the outside world. Each report of German defeats brought quiet satisfaction, validation that their sacrifice on the ridge had contributed to outcomes far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Yet survival remained their primary concern, and survival in a Nazi prison camp required resources deliberately kept scarce. Corporal Svans used his technical background to organize educational classes that kept prisoners mentally active while providing practical knowledge that might prove useful after liberation. His mathematics instruction proved particularly popular among men who had never considered higher education before the war, but now viewed knowledge as resistance against captors, seeking to reduce them to animal status. Education became an act of defiance, proof that American soldiers remained thinking human beings despite German dehumanization attempts. Liberation came on April 23, 1945, when Soviet army elements overran the prison camp during their drive toward Berlin. The Russian troops who freed the American prisoners were frontline infantry, who had been fighting continuously for nearly 4 years, their faces bearing the 1,000-yard stare that marked combat veterans in every army. Language barriers prevented detailed communication, yet the shared experience of warfare created immediate bonds transcending nationality and ideology. Buch weighed 30 pounds less than he had on Lanzerath Ridge, his body consumed by months of inadequate nutrition and psychological stress. Yet his mind remained sharp, already planning the report he would file about German prison conditions and tactical lessons from their ridge defense. His analytical nature had sustained him through captivity, just as it had guided him through combat, providing intellectual frameworks that made sense of experiences that purely emotional responses could never address. The journey home took 6 weeks, a circuitous route through liberated Europe that allowed the former prisoners to gradually readjust to freedom and adequate nutrition. Medical examinations revealed the physical damage inflicted by German captivity, though psychological wounds would require much longer to assess and treat. Many men who had fought so effectively as a unit would struggle to function as individuals in a civilian society, lacking frameworks for understanding their ordeal. Buch returned to civilian life with the same quiet competence that had characterized his military service, rarely speaking about the battle that had defined his youth. The tactical lessons of Lanzerath Ridge were filed in military archives where staff officers could study them. Yet the human cost remained locked inside men who had learned that heroism often proved indistinguishable from simple endurance. Their story disappeared into the vast catalogue of World War II combat actions, just another small unit engagement in a war producing thousands of similar incidents. Not until 1981, 37 years after the battle, did the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon receive the Presidential Unit Citation formally recognizing their contribution to American victory. By then, several of the original 18 men had died, carrying their ridge memories to graves bearing no mention of that morning when they had stopped 500 German paratroopers with discipline, fire, and sheer determination. The citation read like a clinical tactical summary, precise in documenting casualties inflicted and time gained, yet incapable of capturing the human experience of men discovering that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to function effectively despite it. Staff Sergeant Uhosh attended the ceremony in dress uniform, now 63 years old and bearing physical marks of wounds never properly healed. He accepted the citation on behalf of comrades unable to attend, living and dead, saying simply that they had done their duty as soldiers. The lesson of Lanzerath Ridge was both simple and profound. Numbers alone did not determine warfare outcomes. 18 men holding good ground with disciplined leadership and the will to stand when retreat seemed logical had altered the course of a battle involving millions of participants. Their stand had lasted less than 20 hours, but those hours had purchased time allowing democracy to survive its greatest challenge. And in the end, that was enough. In the end, that was everything.